start with Honor of Brother Colin, and I don't think we need to introduce her to anybody. Anyone who's been at any important historical event over the last few years certainly would have seen Honor there. She started life as a musician. She was at 40 years in music. I just asked her what she played, and I think she listed every instrument in the orchestra. Her primary interest is in Renaissance music. Finishing her musical career, she then went into basically the family record, spent some 20 years at that. And she's written two wonderful books. Joseph Plunkett, of course, as part of the O'Brien Press 16 Live series, and the one where I first came across her on, which was about All in the Blood, about Geraldine Plunkett, her diaries, etc. Fantastic book, and if you can get it still, it's worth getting. If it's not, it's in your library without question. I would recommend it. So I give you now Honor of Brother Colin.
Thank you, and it's brilliant to see you all here. It's just extraordinary. This is about getting information out into the general populace, and in particular to the relatives of George Plunkett. I have to say first that I met Micheál in Kilmainham when he was part of the most extraordinary group of historians you might ever come across in your life. He had tremendous insights into the whole thing. It was a huge lift, and anybody who's been to Kilmainham has that sense, and if you haven't, for goodness sake, go. It's amazing. So I'm thanking Micheál for coming today. I'm absolutely delighted. And I also have to thank Dermot Carmody and Mahon Carmody for setting up the techie bit, which is the ultimate nightmare. We hope it'll survive the day. That's always the idea. I have to thank the Lord Mayor, heartfelt thanks. They gave us this place with no compunction whatever, and all the services, and the Mansion House staff are fantastic. Rosemary and Adele in the office, and Michael and Liam doing the stewards. Everything nicely and without fuss, which is always what you hope for. I have people that are doing things that are surprisingly efficiently and wonderfully. Sarah Arnst and Sean Keane have been doing the door, which is essentially you have to have somebody barricading the ramparts. And the Cake Cafe have been absolutely charming and delightful. Have left us the coffee and so on. And if you haven't been to the Cake Cafe, if you're going to say go, it's a lovely experience off Camden Street in a little island of zone, and just a wonderful place. And finally, I want to mention the real without whom, my husband Brendan Ellis, who is always there, doing things, adding stuff, being useful, being informative, and today he's going to be doing some reading as well. Now, the impetus for all this, by the way, can you hear me?
Yes.
The impetus for all this was that I had started working on Count Plunkett, and I found that the subject was absolutely enormous, and I thought, I'm never going to be able to do this. And I asked one of the best historians in Ireland, would he take it on? And he jumped at it, he said, yes, he would. He died only a couple of years ago at the age of 33. Shane Kenna was a gift to Irish history. He managed to have 4 books published before he died, and there can't be many people who managed that, particularly not at that age. He was absolutely wonderful, an extraordinary attitude, he was articulate, lovely way of writing, and a tremendous interest in his subject. So, like many people, I was broken-hearted, and doubly broken-hearted because I couldn't then think what to do with the project, knowing that I wasn't going to be able to write it myself. The second thing that happened was that I was asked to write a chapter for Roscommon History and Society on the 1917 election in Roscommon. And the research for that was absolutely wonderful. But every short biography of Count Plunkett that I came across started with the sentence, Count Plunkett was politicised by his son Joseph after the 1916 Rising, or during the 1916 Rising, or just before the 1916 Rising, which was patent rubbish because there's a huge amount to Count Plunkett. And that's why I was delighted Lara Osbranach had his quote, which is just the opposite, saying that his father influenced Joe. And when you hear the stuff going through that, just keep that in your mind about whether Plunkett was political or not. I better just get started because otherwise I'll talk all day. So Lawrence Cranach wrote a very good biography and thought in 1971 he would get it published, so he translated it into Irish and it was published by Plunkett Children. I found an awful lot in that was he worked with Count Plunkett at one stage. Now, I did want to say there are 3 huge disadvantages that Count Plunkett has. One was his beard. He started growing a beard when he was 17 or thereabouts. It was supposed to keep his chest warm because TB was something everybody was terrified of. So he had a beard from that age and it made him always look about 20 years older. So he was always an old man, particularly to the younger men who were dying to get in there and challenge him. Second was his beautiful manners. People thought he couldn't be passionate, he couldn't be nationalist, he couldn't make speeches. Oddly enough, he made very passionate nationalist speeches in his time. But his beautiful manners are always commented on, and also the fact that he spoke to everybody the same way. He spoke to you, if you were 90 or if you were 3, he spoke to you the same way. The third disadvantage was the title. No matter what way you look at it, George Noble Count Plunkett is a daft name, and it's not his fault. Noble was his mother's name, and Count was because he gave a villa in Rome, we're getting to that, to an order of nuns. But it was assumed that he had come along with something grandiose and European, not British. The British didn't acknowledge his title. They said they didn't like those foreign titles. It then became the simplest thing, and he used it himself eventually, to call him Count Plunkett. So now he was separated, like Lord Dunsany. It made it something different. So, on we go. I wanted to give you a tiny smidgen of early history because it matters very much, because he had in his documents in the National Library, there's a terrific genealogy which goes back to John Plunkett, who died in 1082. That's to say, he was here before 1082, and his son died in 1085. Now that means that he's nearly 100 years before the Anglo-Norman invasion. So he's not so likely to be Norman, even though some of the genealogists claim Norman descent, and even names like Blanchette and so on. There's a lot of these names, Plunkett with an I, and Plunkett with an O. John Plunkett, I think, arrived as soon as the Danish kings were finished in England, and I think he got on his boat, this is the 1040s, got on his boat, came across, got off at the mouth of the Boyne and said, this is where I stay, because that's where Bailin or Bewley is. It wouldn't have been Bewley then. That is obviously not Plunkett House. Oh, sorry, he's not on that. The centre picture on that is the Pope kindly giving Ireland to Henry II. So if you want to start getting cross, now's the time. So here's John Plunkett arriving in Ireland in his boat at the mouth of the Boyne. And he stays there, he builds something, I don't know what, because that's the 17th century house, not the actual Plunkett house. His generations go down through Richard of Rathlegan and all these people, and that's all a direct line down to Fingal, Dunsany, Killeen, all these people who are part of the Plunkett line. When you get to the point where you're talking about castles and so on, Hugh de Lacy was the Lord Lieutenant or thereabouts, I can't remember his title, in Ireland, and again Henry II very kindly gave him County Meath. So he owned County Meath, and in it he built castles to defend against Strongbow, because both he and the king were getting worried about Strongbow taking over the whole of Ireland. Strongbow, as it happens, never came that far. So now you had a few castles to spare, and he had built Trim, Dunsany and Killeen, and at some stage it was acquired by the Cusacks, and then Christopher Plunkett married Joan Cusack in 1399, and now you've got Dunsany and Killeen as Plunkett castles. If you want another nice piece of it, if you think of royalty as being something with a crown on its head, this poor child at 9 months old was told he was King of England. And it meant that they had to have a whole council of regents, and the regent was Duke of Gloucester. And I don't know who was responsible, but somebody gave Killeen the title Lord Killeen to Plunkett at that stage, when poor old Henry was in his cot. When you get to the 17th century, I know I'm jumping around, I'm just saying these are still all in a line, and the line is shown. The genealogy says John, son of John, son of Edward, son of Edward, son of John, son of Lucas, son of John, and so on. But these jumps are just to do with places that matter. The 17th century is the most shocking century in Irish history, bar none. And it's so shocking people don't talk about it, and they certainly don't talk about it enough. In the course of the 17th century, Lucas Moore became Earl of Fingal under Charles the First, has to be, because at that time he was negotiating the Graces, as a number of people were. And the Graces, of course, were the opportunities for Catholics to get out from under privations, like having to pay a fine if you didn't go to a Protestant church on Sunday. And that was one of the ones they did achieve at this time. Now, I have found that he's listed as paying over £2,000, and the normal thing was, for titles, you paid because the king had to raise money for arms and for his pretty belongings all the time. So you subscribed to that. The Plunketts did tend to be royalist, but at the same time, there is a history of Plunketts who, for instance, supported the Irish by giving them arms and horses. There was one who was executed for supporting Lambert Simnel. They supported Irish literature. They were terrific about the Irish context. They didn't have the hang-ups that those people around them did. But they did live in the Pale, and the Pale was like, it's almost like an actual Pale, in other words, a wall between the barons and the lords who were supposed to be called to Parliament in England, and the ones who were outside, in other words, the Irish. And the Pale was governed very strictly by the English monarchy, so there were many things you could and couldn't do. Now, these Plunketts sacrificed extraordinary amounts. Nicholas Plunkett was one of the brains behind the Confederation of Kilkenny, which was an attempt to set up basically a united Ireland with the Old Irish and the Old English and the New Irish and the Normans and everybody else. And he was the chair in Kilkenny. And as you can see, these various members of the family got killed off, including Oliver, of course. He was only a scapegoat, but the others were actually involved in battles, including the Battle of Rathmines and the Battle of Drogheda. And the whole thing became very messy and very difficult, as you might imagine, particularly after Cromwell arrived and started decimating the place. So just a little bit more about Nicholas, because he was extraordinary. He had all these titles, all these positions, and then decided to set up the Confederation of Kilkenny, which was it was a royalist statement, which was also an Irish statement. After they'd been working on various unifications, he went off offering the King of Irelandship to various European kings and the Duke of Lorraine and people like that. So he wasn't popular in England, and he had a bad end, so to speak. In Roath House in Kilkenny was where the Parliament used to meet, and the guy who lent them the house was killed afterwards also by the government. So this was horrible times. This is just to give you a glimpse of the way where the Plunketts have got to now. Very establishment, but very active. All these houses and castles and titles just mean that you get a job, really, and you usually get money with the job. These guys, Christopher Plunkett and so on, we've talked about some of those. The Abbot of Kells, in the time of Henry VIII, smuggled out a book from the monastery when the monastery was being decimated, and he gave it to another Plunkett, Gerald, who took it to Dublin, and it found its way to Archbishop Usher's library, and from there it was left to Trinity College Library, and that's the Book of Kells. So that was Christopher Plunkett's contribution in that case. Now, you know, we're talking about Count Plunkett, and J Plunkett arises as well. Count Plunkett he was one of the Presbyterian branch from Enniskillen, and he was an extraordinary man, greatly valued in Grattan's Parliament, did a huge amount of work, particularly for education and for Catholic emancipation. So he was a very sound, very interesting man. I think it's his grandson is the fourth William, and he's the Bishop of Dublin. And I'm not sure, I think Brendan knows which one is stands at the bus stop in Kildare Street, but it's one of the Cunningham Plunketts anyway. We have, oh yes, of course, Lord Dunsany was more or less the instigator of fantasy novels. Horace Plunkett was the person who started the co-op movement. It was a wonderful, wonderful venture, but he found politics very difficult. He didn't find it easy to get on with people. And of course the co-op movement is gone again already, sadly, in this age of privatisation. And down at the end, Roy Plunkett, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he invented Teflon. Now, after the whole mess was over, the Plunketts were decimated. They lost their lands, they lost their castles, they lost their positions. Anyone who stayed Protestant, if they had become Protestant, could hold on to stuff. Otherwise, what happened, as happened with all of the establishment people in the Pale, who were regarded, as I say, by a threat, first of all by Cromwell's people, but also in the Restoration, they were trusted because they had made moves out on their own. So now when you get to the end of the 17th century, the lands, the houses and things are all gone. And there was a system of having a kind of middleman. So the middleman would take over confiscated land, and then you'd buy land from a middleman. So you didn't have to feel that you were taking land from somebody who really owned it or really deserved it. A rather obnoxious kind of system. And Nicholas Plunkett was exiled, lost his house, his land, everything. They did burn down things quite a lot. And here's Killeen Castle, and now we're jumping again up to the 19th century. Pat Plunkett, Patrick J Plunkett, was George Noble Plunkett's father, and was brought up. He seems to have been born in Dublin, but he was brought up on a farm adjoining Killeen Castle in County Meath, and it's only a stone's throw from Dunsany. When it came to the famine and so on, his father died in 1844, and I think his mother might have died in 45. His grandfather had died in 1824. So there was a line that they actually knew right back to Oliver and that part of the 17th century. Patrick Plunkett then was the one who decided to come to Dublin. The others went everywhere, including New York and England and so on, but he came to Dublin. Can you read these? Yes. In Dublin, he found a wife. Now the great thing always, and the Plunketts were very good at this, was to find a wife who had land, property, money, anything that you could lay your hands on. They didn't tend to do raping and pillaging, but they did do annexation, let's say. He found a wife who was part of a family. Her father was half Italian, possibly partly Jewish, and her mother was one of the 21 grandchildren of the Sullivans of Tralee. They had leather shops in various places in Dublin, where she was brought up. She was brought up in Mary's Abbey, and now if you just look, Cable Street is upside down. Mary's Abbey there on your right. So, in other words, if you came from the bridge onto Cable Street, Mary's Abbey is the left-hand turn, and in the 1610 map, Mary's Abbey takes up the whole of that area. It's enormous. It was a big administrative and monastic settlement, and I imagine it was also decimated in the time of the Reformation, but which was huge. There is still a remnant of the Abbey underground, more or less. If you want to trundle down there, you go down Mary's Abbey, but there's nothing left of the shops or the 19th century houses that were there. So the nobles lived in a house over a shop on Mary's Abbey, and they had another one on Abbey Street, and another one on Stephen Street, up at George's Street. Elizabeth Noble was always known as Best Noble, and these are where she had her shop. The corner of she was married to a man who was Catholic, and her father thought that she should have been married to a Protestant to keep some power and money in the house. So he dissolved the marriage on the day, and she never got to live with the husband. And when he was dying, she wanted to go and nurse him, and her father wouldn't allow her. So that was the end of their relationship. But the husband left her all his money, and she bought this house. It was unusual to buy a shop and house. So she bought this on the corner of Ainger Street. That's the modern version, obviously, on the ground floor. But the top, I think, is very similar to what it was like. And that's Ainger Street in 1900 or thereabouts. And you can actually see her shop is right the right-hand side of the street at the very end. And this then is George's Street. These beautiful drawings are by Shaw. If you have the Shaw directory, it'll give you total pleasure all the time. Shaw's directory, you can see Pim's shop, some of you might remember it, and beside Pim's is Cranny's Boots and Shoes, and they did boots and shoes for the Lord Lieutenant, and I still haven't found out how you get that appellation, but people had it. So now you have George Noble Plunkett being born. Noble, of course, was his mother's name, and Plunkett being his father, and he kept that all his life as his entire name. When he was born in Ainger Street at number 1 there, two men, it's said maybe 6 months later, maybe when he was born, it's given different versions. I think nearly everybody in the family has a different version, or a slightly different version. Two men called in. They had heard that there was a baby in the house, and they knew that they were nationalists, and that's another of those things. It was known already that Pat Plunkett was a nationalist, not radical, but he was, and Bess Noble certainly was. She was, and in her later life, she made friends with Anne Devlin, for whom Micheál has done a huge amount of work in restoring, extraordinary woman who did so much for Emmet. So they heard there was a baby in the house, and they came and said, "Can we hold the baby?" And they each held the baby, and they said, "Now tell him when he grows up that the big drummer and the little drummer from Vinegar Hill held him when he was a baby." And Vinegar Hill, of course, being 1798, the rebellion. You would think that might be a good story, but when George was 21, a young fellow came to the house and said he was a nephew of one of the drummers, and they had died, but his uncle had told him that he was to call to the house and to tell George that they had held him when he was a baby, in case nobody had told him. Now, these are main characters. Pat Plunkett with his son George, and you always get an impression of great affection between Pat Plunkett and his children. George was the only surviving child. The other two both died. One as a baby, and the other one when she was about 12 or 13. Was very sad. She was much loved, and TB was a great fear in the family. And then in the middle of Pat Cranny. And the Crannys and the Plunketts were related through the wives. The wives were first cousins. And again, because being one of the 21 children from Tralee, I think that there was a carriage building business in Tralee, and I think that's where the money came from, because these women both came with trustees. So they must have been afraid that the husbands would simply drink the money or whatever. And then you have Mariah Cranny. Now she's the one, Mariah Keane. She's one of the O'Sullivans, and she would be first cousin to Bess Noble. And here is Josephine. And Josephine and George, of course, get married in due course. Pat Plunkett started his building on Belgrave Road with the first 3 houses. And Siobhan lived in number 3, I think, for a time. The first 3 houses were designed by E.H. Carson, who was the father of the campaigner for Home Rule and Protestant Northern Ireland and all that kind of stuff. A very, very virulent campaigner. But his father was a really good architect, but he was a bit dodgy about money. So himself and Pat Plunkett parted company. But these are 3 extraordinary houses. This then became an overseas house later on. And Pat Plunkett then went on. After that he used, he didn't use an architect again, he used the pattern book drawings. And he developed the rest of that side of Belgrave Road, and then he bought the site on Parston Road, which is huge. In other words, he was the ground landlord of Parston Road and the developer of it. And in this, you can see, this is 1862, I think, or 65. You can see the 6 houses up there. Those are the first 6 houses that Pat Plunkett built on Palmerston Road. And here you can see the mention of the Bloody Fields, which some will tell you was 12th century invasion by the Bristol men from Dublin, but is actually much more likely to be the Battle of Rathmines in 1649. So George had a terrific, now I should have said at the beginning, Mary and I have agreed that we will probably cross information at various times, because obviously we're coming from similar stuff, and I have a feeling she has something on this. So I'll quickly go through the schools. We had a little medal at home which said Mrs. Rose School on it, and he must have been there. I think it was a kindergarten school, and of course I've lost it. You know the way you do. And then he went to Nice. Now his mother brought him to Nice for his health, and Nice at the time was thought of as the most healthy climate in Europe, certainly. So it was recommended by doctors and so on. And she brought him there for 3 years, which is a long time, and he had his holidays in Saint Remo. So that was a long time out of Ireland. It didn't seem to bother him at all. He had very equable temperament, and the result was he spoke excellent Italian and French, because he was there in 1869 as part of his 3 years, and the French were given Nice back, which was always going back and forth between France and Italy. So he spoke both French and Italian very well. And I'm sorry, just to say, he went to the Oblate Fathers in Upper Mount Street, and a wonderful piece by J O'Kelly says that he went to Dr. Quinn's place on Harcourt Street, which was the beginning of CUS. I get the impression he wasn't there for very long, but he did meet Robert Dwyer Joyce, the poet. And one of the things that Dwyer Joyce wrote is a beautiful ballad called The Wind That Shakes the Barley, if you've ever come across that. And apparently he took a lot of interest in Plunkett, as did George Sigerson when he got to Clongowes. George Sigerson, again, a great teacher. Clongowes, when George got there, it was, I must have given you wrong dates, I just said 69 for the French and all that, that's wrong. Because it was 67 when he got there. I hope I'm right about that. The point is, anyway, that it had become a very politicised school from the boys' point of view, with a lot of argument, a lot of debate. It was Thomas Davis had died in 45, and now you had the Fenians, and the Fenian proclamation came out in 67. And I think there is no way that he couldn't have read it. I don't have evidence that he'd read it or knew it, but I'm absolutely certain he must have, because he couldn't have avoided it. So we thought it was such an extraordinary document that would you like to read it?
Yeah. And just some extracts from it. It's about twice as long as this, and if you come across it, get it. The Irish people of the world, it's addressed to. We have suffered centuries of outrage, enforced poverty, and bitter misery. Our rights and liberties have been trampled on by an alien aristocracy who, treating us as foes, usurped our lands and drew away from our unfortunate country all material riches. We appealed in vain to the reason and sense of justice of the dominant powers. Our mildest remonstrances were met with sneers and contempt. All men are born with equal rights, and in associating to protect one another and share public burdens, justice demands that such associations should rest upon a basis which maintains equality instead of destroying it. We therefore declare that, unable longer to endure the curse of monarchical government, we aim at founding a republic based on universal suffrage, which shall secure to all the intrinsic value of their labour. We declare also in favour of absolute liberty of conscience and complete separation of church and state. We intend no war against the people of England. Our war is against the aristocratic locusts, whether English or Irish, who have eaten the verdure of our fields, against the aristocratic leeches who drain alike our fields and theirs. As for you, workmen of England, it is not only your hearts we wish, but your arms. Remember the starvation and degradation brought to your firesides by the oppression of labour. Herewith we proclaim the Irish Republic. Signed by the British government.
not 1916, it's 1867, and they really knew what they were talking about. Now, I should gallop through this. George went to Italy many times, I don't know how many times, but he went there to study, and he went there to look at paintings, and generally speaking to enjoy the architecture. He was that sort. And on his way back in 1870, he got stuck in Paris. I never heard the ins and outs of that, I'd love to know, because the Prussians laid siege to Paris at the end of 1870 into January of 1871. He seems to have come out alive and well. And here he goes to Trinity. His mother particularly, she was, this is 72 when he goes to Trinity, I think. She was going to die very shortly after that, so he, I think, followed her instructions. But he just enjoyed himself. He didn't do the degree in the end. He got prizes and things. He engaged in debates. He was involved in all sorts of stuff. And met extraordinary people. But he didn't actually finish that degree. He was kind of waiting to do a law degree. These are just some of his friends, not just, they're extraordinary. From left to right at the top is Isaac Butt, for whom he had enormous admiration, and he worked with him, he joined his organisation and worked with him on the beginnings of the Home Rule movement. The next one is Roger Casement, whom he met, now I don't know how and where he met him, but he brought him home to lunch, and Casement had just been to the Congo and back, and he talked about what he'd seen, the absolute horrors that he had tried to prevent and created a report on. And he did come later, I think, when after Putumayo, when he'd seen similar kinds of stuff, becoming very unpopular with the British because they wanted to keep Belgian links going. Obviously Charles Stewart Parnell here on the right hand side, for whom Plunkett was what they always called faithful. In other words, he stayed loyal to him after the priests started running him down for marrying a divorcee, and Plunkett did a lot of work with him. He stood as a Parnellite candidate. I'll come to that in a moment. Bottom right is Bram Stoker, author of Dracula, who again is a friend. Oscar Wilde, who was a good friend. They had quite a bit of correspondence after Wilde went to England. And unfortunately, George's wife, Josephine, just knew that there was a scandal, and she threw all the letters in the fire. But I don't think she knew what the scandal was. That's himself, George, in the middle. Catherine Tynan, who gives him a very good character, a great friend. She thought an awful lot of him. And she was one of 3 people, including Rosa Mulholland, whom he published when he was running a small magazine. It was very difficult to get yourself published as a woman poet, or woman writer at all, under your own name at that time. And his magazine was the 1880s, Hibernia. Who's in the far corner?
Horace.
Who's?
Horace.
I haven't got it. And Arthur Griffith, of course, up here. Griffith and himself were involved in the setup of the Preservation of Irish Language Society and various other things like that. But later they were at loggerheads. I know who that, sorry, it's Dowden, the Shakespeare scholar. And again, in Trinity, himself and Dowden set up Shakespeare societies and so on. Meanwhile, the Da and Pat Cranny are out building all over Dublin, in Rathmines, Donnybrook, Ballsbridge, and so on. And the Crannies live in Mucker's house on Model Road, and the Plunketts live on Palmerston Road, a beautiful house, number 14. And then those other houses are places like that's Palmerston Road and Marlborough Road, Elgin Road, etc. Lots of houses. So eventually, the merger happens. He had proposed to her 10 years beforehand when she was 16, but parents didn't, they're a bit shocked because she was proposed to 3 times in one day, which happens to one of Bram Stoker's people as well, so that's an interesting coincidence. And when he came back from Rome, I'm feeling that this is going to be the room. Yes, should have been there. this time when he went to Rome, he met with friends, the Blue Nuns, and he knew a few of them. They were Irish, very recently started by Mary Potter, an English nun, and they had nowhere as a proper house in Rome, and the Pope wanted them to set up a branch there. So George, being a young man with money, went off, found a house, gave it to them, got it cleaned up, tidied the garden, set up a chapel, and handed it over. And the Pope was quite pleased, because at the time he was under siege from Victor Emmanuel, because Italy was just about to be unified. So he was losing property around the place. So another little piece of property that was given to the church was a great asset, and he then made George a knight of the knight commander of the Holy Sepulchre, and that enabled him to marry. The family said, "Oh yes, we'll have a count." That's all right. So here you have the two builders are middle left is Pat Cranny, and the top right is Pat Plunkett, and behind Pat Cranny you have Gerald Cranny, the architect, and beside him is John Joe Cranny, the doctor. These are very important people in the sense that they're first generation Catholic educated. They can go to university, they can have jobs. The change that emancipation has made is really being felt, and it makes a considerable difference to wealth and authority. In the middle, of course, George and his new wife Josephine, and beside her is Frank, the remittance man, who had committed crimes of embezzlement and so on. He's shipped off to Australia, and he was supposed to stay in Australia on a remittance, but he came back every now and then, including for the wedding. And beside Frank is Helena, and she is Pat Plunkett's second wife, another O'Sullivan. So that's three cousins, all married to two men. A lovely woman, and they had 4 more children. This is the eldest child, Jermaine, and Mariah Cranny, who is the mother. She's very dowager type, very tough, I think a bit of a bully, and very, very competent at just about everything. And below her then, we think, I've had some contact with the Australian Crannies, we think that that is the eldest daughter of Frank Cranny. That's not absolutely certain. That's that one. They had a small settlement of 8 houses in Rathmines and 7 houses in Donnybrook, and 3 farms in Clare, and a house in Fitzwilliam Street, the way you would. Now, there's Shane's book on O'Donovan Rossa, long overdue as a piece, but of course he does a wonderful job on it, and we're all indebted to him. These are people that Count Plunkett knew, and again I'm just trundling along on the same thing, that he was certainly political this time. So he knew these before they went off to the States. He knew O'Donovan Rossa, I think he knew Devoy, and I think he only got to know John Boyle O'Reilly in the States. And the reason he was in the States was that they were on their 2-year honeymoon. They went all over the States, they met relatives everywhere, they met politicians, they met all kinds of things. They nearly settled down to grow oranges in California, but they didn't. George Plunkett stood as a candidate, as I said before, first of all in Mid-Tyrone as a Parnellite, and he was there as a stalking horse to divide the vote. And he could do that because he could afford to lose his deposit. That was basically the thing. He then started working on the Stephen's Green Register, which Stephen's Green division for voting purposes went all the way from Stephen's Green right out to Blackrock, so it's a huge district. And he started working on the register, which was obviously being used corruptly. There was a system of having a lodger in the house, and your child could be a lodger. Anybody could walk in and say, I'm a lodger, and get a vote, you know. So he worked on that, revised it all at his own expense over a number of years, and then he stood for election in '95, and I think it's at that one that he says, you know, are we going to vote for the country that crushes us, or vote for our own freedom? And again, the sense that he was political. In '98 he stood again, and he very nearly got in, but when it came to 1900 and Redmond took over the Irish Parliamentary Party, Redmond and himself had been in Clongowes at the same time. I don't know whether that had anything to do with it, but Redmond thought that Plunkett was too radical, too far out. Plunkett wanted trade tariffs between Ireland and England because England was swamping Ireland as usual. Parnell, of course, married Catherine O'Shea, and there was hell to pay with the priests in Ireland, and Plunkett stayed very faithful and very fond of Parnell. And one of the last things Parnell did was to call at 26, before he went off to Brighton, to call at the Plunkett house, but George was out. This is the menagerie of children. These are, I put it in partly because they're dressed to go to a fancy dress in the Mansion House here. Lord Mayor's fancy dress party. That's in fact the day after they go back and they get dressed up again in the thing. My grandmother's on the left, far left, and she hated the whole process, being poked and stuffed into clothes that she didn't like, going to a party where it was meant for grown-ups and not for children. But they do look rather dramatic. So that is Geraldine, Mimi, the eldest, Moya, and Joe, in those four. And Joe is dressed as a gallaglass. And then these three, again dressed up probably by the photographer, George, Fina and Jack, and not really looking like they were going to in about 20 years' time, and the parents on the outside. This is George finally getting to the stage where he takes his law degree, makes him respectable, and this is the business about Redmond and John Dillon also taking over the party. And I thought that it was only John Dillon who was a vicious anti-women. He was a serious misogynist. He thought the idea of giving votes to women was appalling, at the end of civilization as we know it, but apparently Redmond was the same. So. And finally, this is the five children, looking, I think, lovely. It's my favourite photograph of them. And the book on Botticelli, which Count Plunkett brought out, that's in Mary's domain. So, there we go. Thank you.